The last 48 hours have seen a series of incredible tectonic shifts in the Ukraine war, particularly when it comes to Russia's approach to its military operations in Ukraine. And that is what I would like to talk about today. First, let us begin with a brief recap of some of the news that we have heard over the last 2 days. And the first bit of major news is that there will be referendums held over all of the regions of Ukraine which Russia controls, and these referendums will be held on the topic of these regions joining Russia, or if you prefer, Russia annexing these territories. Specifically, we are talking about the regions of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. And there is one very interesting detail in these referendums. As many of you well know, Russia does not control all of these territories. Russia controls only a part of all of these territories, with the exception of Lugansk region, which has been 100% under Russian control since the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk operation. The other 3 regions are split between the Russian armed forces, which control the majority of each of these regions, and the Ukrainian armed forces, which control some part of these territories. And the interesting detail here is this: Russia plans to incorporate the full territory of these regions into the Russian Federation. That is to say that even the territories within these regions that have been under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces since the start of the war, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, will now be, at least as far as the Russian legal system is concerned, formally a part of the Russian Federation. And it should be noted that these referendums are to be held from September 23rd to September 27th. That is to say that in about a week, by September 28th, I think it's safe to say that these territories will formally be considered to be a part of the Russian Federation. Now, the other big piece of news that comes hand in hand with these referendums is the announcement of a partial military mobilization in Russia. On September 21st, that is the same day as I am recording this video, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made an address to the nation in which he explained the situation. According to the Russian president, Russia is no longer merely fighting the armed forces of Ukraine, but rather is fighting against all of NATO, which is fighting a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. That is to say, not only is the collective West supplying Ukraine with an increasing number of weapon systems, providing Ukraine with all of the material and resources that are necessary in order to continue this war, not only are the various officers and generals of NATO countries present in Ukraine on the ground, de facto controlling the overall operations that are being performed by the Ukrainian armed forces. Not only is NATO's vast satellite network and military intelligence apparatus working against Russia to the fullest extent that it can in Ukraine, but also that over the last several weeks there have been a growing number of reports of NATO PMCs, private military companies, fighting on the ground against the Russian soldiers and against the soldiers of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So, in summary, the forces that have been arrayed against Russia are fairly significant, much too significant in order for the Russian military to deal with them, while still being limited to the framework of the special military operation as it was up until now. This framework, which by its nature suggests some kind of strange half-military, half-policing organization against a country of 30 to 40 million people. And as President Putin has also noted, this war has become existential for Russia. It has become existential for Russia because it is being waged against Russia by the collective West using Ukraine as a proxy. The various politicians and NGOs of the collective West have already publicly revealed their intentions, to not only inflict a military defeat on Russia, but to, following that military defeat, to quote-unquote decolonize Russia, which of course is just a euphemism for carving Russia up into various little independent statelets, dividing Russia according to its ethnic and religious lines, and to, simply put, make Russia stop existing. And according to the Russian president, this fact, in combination with the Ukrainian government's blatant, outright, open refusal to conduct any peace negotiations with Russia, forces Russia to escalate its special military operation. And so, Russia's choice in escalating the conflict in Ukraine can be briefly summarized as follows: a full mobilization of Russia's military-industrial complex, which will now be producing weapon systems around the clock. The majority of Russian military factories will be working around the clock in order to fulfill a growing number of government contracts. And also, on top of this, there will be a partial mobilization of Russia's reserves of manpower. Now, in this presidential address, and also in an interview that was conducted on the same day with the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, it was revealed that Russia plans to mobilize about 300,000 additional soldiers. And it was revealed that the first group of individuals who are going to be targeted for this partial military mobilization are Russian military reservists, who in total number around 2 million. The second category of individuals that can be sent to the front lines to fight in the Ukraine war but are less likely to be drafted are individuals that have served in the Russian army as conscripts. The Russian army has mandatory conscription, and about half of Russian men serve in the Russian army for about a year. This is the category that can potentially be drafted and sent to the front lines, but is much less likely to be drafted than former military contractors. And the last group of individuals that can now legally be conscripted and sent to the front lines, should the need to do so arise, are all the other military-aged men in Russia that do not have some kind of crippling disease or disability that prevents them from serving in the military. I stress that these individuals can now legally be conscripted, but the chances of them being conscripted in the foreseeable future is pretty much none. Now, the fact that this can now legally be done brings me to my next point. The Russian Duma is currently in the process of reviewing, amending various laws, as well as introducing new laws that will allow Russia to expand its military operations in Ukraine. And perhaps the greatest of these changes, the most important change, is that the militias of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic will now be formally integrated into the Russian military. I would like to remind everybody that up until now, the Russian force in Ukraine, what most people collectively refer to as this big Russian force in Ukraine, really consisted of a small number of Russian regular army units fighting alongside Russian National Guard units, fighting alongside various Russian special forces, private military companies, which fought alongside Chechen battalions, which in turn fought alongside the militias of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and all of these organizations had radically different command structures, equipment, and as a result, you had this big mess of a force that really lacked any cohesion. That is now being done away with. And instead of these various groupings that formally belong to various different organizations but informally fight for the same side, Now, instead of that, there will be one big Russian military fighting in Ukraine. Another important law which is being passed will allow foreign volunteers to fight alongside the Russian military in a military structure that is analogous to the French Foreign Legion. This military structure will see volunteers from various countries across the world. There were, at the start of the special military operation, reports of tens of thousands of volunteers from the Syrian Arab Army, from various African countries, and later there were reports of upwards of 100,000 North Korean soldiers, all of whom could potentially have fought on the side of the Russians in this war, but Russia simply refused their aid. Well, Russia is now backtracking on those constraints. From now on, the Russian military is going to allow foreign citizens to fight alongside its own armed forces in the Ukraine war. Something which, by the way, the Ukrainian military has been doing since the very first days of the war. In fact, if you consider the start of this war as being February 24th, the Ukrainian military has been using foreign contractors or mercenaries, if you prefer, since before the war with Russia even began. Other important changes within the legal system of the Russian military include that desertion is now going to be punishable by a lengthy prison sentence, something on the order of 10 years. Up until now, desertion was pretty much technically legal, but barely punished within the Russian military. It was punishable by a slap on the wrist, and as a result, a number of Russian military units, many of whom were volunteers, arrived to the front lines in the Ukraine war and then simply refused to carry out their military orders. Now, doing so is going to be punishable by a lengthy prison sentence. Another important law which has been introduced makes it mandatory for private companies to fulfill any contracts offered to it by the Russian military. So, for example, a private company that owns some factory which produces some equipment that could be useful to Russia's war effort is now going to be obliged to fulfill said contract. And lastly, a military update that I think is worth mentioning. This comes from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and it holds that the Russians are currently in the process of redeploying their various military units from Syria in order to fight in Ukraine. So, all of that is the big news digest over the last 48 hours. Now, let's try to make some sense of this. The first thing that needs to be said, and this goes beyond any doubt, is that Russia is massively escalating its operations in Ukraine. Up until now, we've seen maybe 100,000 Russian military personnel, and I'm including the various Chechen units, the Wagner private military company, as well as various volunteers in that number. These 100,000 Russian soldiers were fighting alongside perhaps about another 100,000 forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And the reason for this rather small military deployment was the fact that up until now, Russia was not waging a war against Ukraine, but rather participating in a special military operation, which, as I explained previously, by its definition entails a very limited troop deployment. We are currently seeing this framework of the special military operation that was announced on February 24th being done away with. And the reason that it's being done away with is, to put it simply, because it hasn't worked. Ukraine has proven time and time again that its own military, especially when it is backed by the collective West to the degree that it is much too strong to be completely destroyed by this small, limited troop deployment that the Russians have sent up until now. And because the Russians had limited themselves to the framework of this special military operation, the Ukrainians have, up until now, enjoyed a significant numerical advantage, at least when it comes to manpower, in the fighting on the front lines. And as recent events have shown, that numerical advantage has only been growing. In addition to this, Russia's initial advantage in weapons systems, specifically when it comes to aircraft, when it comes to artillery, as well as various other systems, has been increasingly mitigated by various weapons deliveries from the collective West. Specifically, when it comes to Russia's air power, Ukraine has been receiving a growing number of Stinger man-portable air defense missiles from the very start of this war, but also recently they have received more modern radars that can detect various Russian military aircraft. And we've also seen deployments of the S-300 air defense system, as well as the more recent deployment of the Norwegian-built NASAMS air defense system. In addition to this, the United States has sent its HARM missiles to Ukraine, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, in order to allow Ukrainian aircraft to target and destroy Russian air defense systems. And perhaps one can also mention the HIMARS system in addition to this, which allows Ukraine to conduct pinpoint missile attacks against frontline Russian military airfields. When it comes to Russia's advantage in artillery systems, this advantage has also been slowly mitigating due to weapons deliveries from the collective West. The collective West has not only sent a very large number of artillery guns and mobile rocket systems, the M777 has proven itself to be quite an effective weapon system, as well as various self-propelled guns that have been sent by France, Germany, as well as other countries within NATO. The United States has delivered a very large number of artillery shells to ensure that the Ukrainian army does not run out of ammunition. There were the deliveries of the HIMARS missile system as well as the MLRS system from the United States, the United Kingdom, and also from Germany. But on top of this, recently it has become clear that the collective West has delivered a very large number of guided artillery shells to the Ukrainian military. These guided shells are, as the name implies, much more accurate than regular artillery shells, and they are often able to hit their target from the very first shot. And of course, the collective West has also been busy supplying Ukraine with all of the raw materials and resources that it needs to continue its war effort, starting with the fuel that the Ukrainian military needs in order to operate its vehicles, and ending with the regular injections of money that the Ukrainian government receives and feeds to its economy in order to prevent the latter from simply collapsing and falling into hyperinflation. Now, the reason that I'm bringing all of this up is to emphasize that if it were not for the extensive military aid that the collective West has given to Ukraine, the idea that Russia had at the start of this war to conduct this special military operation using this very limited deployment of only about 100,000 troops may have actually worked, although, in my opinion, the military logic of it, even back then, was, well, to put it lightly, highly debatable. However, given the fact that the West has gone full on in supporting Ukraine in this war, something that, I should add, was to be expected, the special military operation has failed. And the singular event which has shown this to undoubtedly be the case was Ukraine's recent counteroffensive in Kharkov region, in which the Ukrainian army, as well as many NATO private military companies fighting alongside the Ukrainian armed forces, attacked the positions that were held by the militias of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and took the entire territory within only 4 days. That event has demonstrated like no other that the Russians simply do not have enough manpower not only to continue their offensive, but to even hold the territories that they have previously captured from the Ukrainians. And as a result of that military catastrophe, we are now seeing the Russian leadership responding by escalating their intervention in Ukraine. Now, in my opinion, this escalation was to be expected. And not only was it to be expected, but I would add that it is actually rather meager compared to what Russia could potentially do and compared to what, arguably, Russia is going to be forced to do in the end. That is to say that this new framework of Russia's military intervention in Ukraine is still nowhere near the full might of the Russian military that could theoretically be deployed. So when we are talking about the 300,000 Russian soldiers that are to be mobilized and sent to the front lines in Ukraine, we are talking about an increase in the total number of pro-Russian soldiers in the war, growing from about 200,000 to maybe 500,000 or perhaps 600,000 if a sufficient number of domestic and foreign volunteers also sign up. And this is more or less equal, perhaps a little bit more than the total number of soldiers that are fighting on the Ukrainian side of this war. Now, of course, the major difference between the Russian military mobilization and the Ukrainian military mobilization is that Russia is only now on the 7th month of its special military operation, just starting with a partial military mobilization. Ukraine has been going full on, conscripting all military-aged men who are even remotely fit for service from the very beginning of this war. Russia still can, theoretically and even in practice, deploy many hundreds of thousands more soldiers to Ukraine. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the current deployment of 300,000 additional troops that we are hearing about is merely going to be the first wave, so to speak. That is to say that these 300,000 soldiers are going to be trained, armed, prepared, and sent to the front lines sometime by the winter, perhaps by the month of December. And after that, we are going to start seeing a few 100,000 more troops being trained, armed, and prepared to be sent to the front lines to reinforce this current troop deployment. Now, I'm not going to try to make any concrete predictions on whether or not that is going to happen, but in my opinion, it is something to watch out for, whether or not Russia is going to continue escalating its intervention in Ukraine. Of course, another way that Russia can still escalate its intervention in Ukraine is to start using its arsenal of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles against targets that are of strategic significance. That is to say, anything from various regional and municipal administration offices, the presidential office of Zelensky, the Ukrainian Rada, the various power plants that supply electricity throughout all of Ukraine, these power plants, which, by the way, enable the Ukrainian railroad system to continue functioning. Such missiles could be fired at various railway hubs, at various train stations, and they could also be used to destroy the various bridges that cross the Dnieper River as well as other bridges that cross other rivers all throughout Ukraine. Now, I have expressed my puzzlement before as to why Russia has not done at least some of this a long time ago. Of course, striking civilian power plants is going to create a humanitarian mega catastrophe throughout all of Ukraine. So whether or not it is worth going through that in order to gain some small military advantage, perhaps even a large military advantage, is debatable. But many of these other targets can be targeted by Russian cruise and ballistic missiles without creating any sort of humanitarian mega catastrophe, and they would still offer the Russians a military advantage. So far, we've only seen a couple of strikes against Ukrainian power plants. Specifically, there was that one strike after the Russian retreat from Izium and Balakleya, which took out a major Ukrainian power station in Kharkov region. But the Ukrainians, having lost only one power station, were easily able to compensate for that by rerouting their power grid to continue supplying electricity from various other power stations, at least where various critical infrastructure is concerned. And there was also a much smaller strike against a power station in the city of Slavyansk, and from what I understand, this latter strike was not conducted by missiles, but rather by artillery. And over the last few days, there have also been a few incidents in which the Russians have struck Ukrainian dams in order to flood the nearby rivers, and in turn prevent the Ukrainian armed forces from carrying out offensives in these areas. That is very, very little compared to what the Russian arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles could potentially inflict upon Ukraine. And I think that it is also important to note that Ukraine, having a much smaller physical capability to strike strategic targets, has not shied away from doing so either in the region of Kherson, in the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, or even on the territory of the, if you prefer, the Russian mainland. That is to say, the regions of Belgorod and Kursk, which border Ukraine. Ukraine has used HIMARS missiles to strike the administrative offices within Kherson region. Ukraine has continued widespread shelling of the city of Donetsk, which has killed about a dozen citizens every single day over the last week or so. Ukraine has shelled power stations located in Belgorod region. Ukraine has shelled water filtration systems in Donetsk city. Ukraine has shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. All of this has been happening for a while and is continuing to happen on an almost daily basis up until this day. So it seems very strange that even as Russia is de facto moving away from this special military operation and escalating this conflict into something that is a little bit more resembling of a serious war, quote unquote, that Russia is still refusing to carry out strikes, missile attacks on important Ukrainian infrastructure. The reason that I am mentioning all of this is to emphasize that Russia still has plenty of routes through which it can further escalate this war and put even more pressure onto Ukraine, whereas Ukraine does not have many ways to do anything similar, unless, as I have been saying from the very beginning, NATO is going to intervene in Ukraine on a massive, much more massive scale than it has done up until now. And of course, if NATO does intervene on the ground in Ukraine, that is basically going to be a guarantee that the next thing that follows will be a nuclear war. So that is the summary of the strategic situation and how it has shaped up over the last several days. Russia still holds, and has always held since the very beginning, all of the major military cards. Ukraine is, on a strategic level, vastly outmatched by Russia. However, Russia has been very hesitant, very unwilling to use many of the cards that it has from the very beginning of this war. These self-imposed limitations that the Russian military had at the beginning of the war are slowly being taken away. Many of them are still there. Russia is still not fighting anywhere near to its fullest extent. However, what we're going to see within the next few months is undoubtedly going to be a much larger and much more serious troop deployment than what we have seen up until now. It should also be noted that it, of course, takes some time to first conscript, second, to train and equip these forces, and third, to send them to the front lines in Ukraine. So these forces aren't going to appear tomorrow. The Ukrainians are still going to have numerical superiority, as well as some limited superiority or perhaps parity in various fighting equipment on the front lines, at least for the next several months. However, Ukraine only has a very limited amount of time left until Rasputitsa starts, that is the mud season in Eastern Europe, when all of the roads, all of the fields and open areas become very muddy and difficult to traverse. At this time, conducting an offensive is going to be very difficult. However, Ukraine still has at least a couple more weeks in which it can conduct an offensive before these Russian forces arrive and before Rasputitsa begins. And we have heard a number of reports from Russian military intelligence and various sources that are connected to the Russian military, the Russian Ministry of Defense, that the Ukrainians are currently busy redeploying massive amounts of forces from Kharkov, from Kiev, and from many other locations, presumably in order to start such an offensive. At least that is what the open source military intelligence suggests. Potential targets for this military offensive include the region of Zaporozhye and also the part of Kharkov region, the tiny sliver that still remains under Russia's control. Whether or not Ukraine is going to use this opportunity in order to launch some sort of big offensive, I think that we will have to wait and see. This concludes my thoughts on the situation in the Ukraine war as of today, September 21st. As always, if you enjoyed this analysis, please be sure to leave a like, and also please be sure to check out my other channels, especially my Telegram channel, the link to which will be in the video description as well as in a pinned comment. On my Telegram channel, you will find various reports, analyses written in text, as well as occasional videos that I forward from other channels, which I do not post on YouTube. So if you enjoy my analyses, please be sure to check out my Telegram channel as well. With that said, I thank you for listening and I wish you all a wonderful day.